Good evening, everybody. This is the second session, and during this second session, with the help of many distinguished... It worked? Does it work? Yes. Of many distinguished colleagues from other countries, we will discuss about working. Now? Yes, okay. So, it works. So, good afternoon again, everybody, and we are going to discuss in our second session about agri-food law. We will spend some words later about the use of this expression, agri-food law, and innovation and globalization in a comparative perspective. And so, before introducing the discussion of this afternoon, I am very pleased to give the word to a colleague. She is a representative. She teaches in the University of Parma, and she is a representative of the Italian Association of Comparative Law, that in next spring will have their International Congress in Parma regarding agri-food law, a comparative perspective. So thank you very much for your intervention.
Thank you, President. Good afternoon. As a professor, Albicini has already told you, I am Lucia Scaffardi, Professor of Public Comparative Law in the University of Parma. I am here today on the behalf of Professor Vincenzo Zeno-Zenkovic, President of the Italian Association of Comparative Law, who sends you his warmest greetings and apologizes for not being with us today at the annual conference of the Italian Agri-Food Law Association. I am honored to have the possibility to participate in this inspiring conference and to have the opportunity to listen to all these interesting presentations and qualified speakers. Touching different topics and issues, this conference has the great merit to underline the significance of an interdisciplinary approach to the food law and to understand the useful contribution which comparative studies could give in this field. This aspect is emphasized not only in the title of this conference, where comparison is used, an important lens to understand the innovation in agri-food law, but also in this specific second section dedicated to agri-food law and globalization. It is not by chance that today I am here to speak in front of you in this particular section, as I am glad to present you all an important event where we will have the opportunity to talk again about food law from a comparative perspective. The Italian Association of Comparative Law decided to dedicate its biennial colloquium to food law to be held at the Parma University from the 23rd to the 25th of May in 2019. A call for paper is now open, addressing both full and associate professors. If you are interested, you can find all the details on the website on the association. I mean, dirittocomparato.org. Without taking up more of your time, I wish you a good work during this section, and I hope to see you in Parma in 2019. Thank you all, and a special thanks to the organizer, Professor Izzo, and to Professor Albicini and Iannarelli for the kind invitation, and for the time and opportunity to present our important event. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, dear colleague, and we are really proud to understand that what we assumed as a basis to have this Congress, we started in our presentation with our friends Umberto Izzo and Matteo Ferrari, and worked during the last months using this first word, Global Food Law Laboratory, because we really are of the opinion that this laboratory has given, but in fact is giving even today, us the chance, and the very interesting speeches that we listened this morning gave a sort of fresco of this situation. What is going on? We are facing important innovations. We spoke a lot about innovation this morning regarding both the institutions which are called to operate within this area, but even the substance of the regulation. And what is much more important, the role of the science. And this relation, peculiar relation, I must say that I'm very happy to see a colleague from Law of Economics with us, because we showed in many other occasions during the years the same approach, the difficulty to find a point of relation and a point of balance between different interests of what Montesquieu called the nature of things, or Giulio Ascarelli, la natura delle cose. So the idea, and this is also a sort of small answer to the question of this morning. Yes, we as agri-food lawyers always are under duty, not under pressure, under duty to take in our mind the nature of things. And this nature of things is emerging within global food law. For a consideration which Professor Costato stressed this morning when he said this is the sort of product that we have to destroy. And of course, we ingest it. It becomes part of ourselves. And this is why there was a French scholar who wrote many years ago, Le consommateur entretient une relation plus intime avec sa nourriture. Plus intime, because it is becoming part of us. And this explains why, in this area, in some cases, we are facing problems, topics, issues, in some cases even experimenting new solutions that in some cases, as Pascuzzi very well exposed this morning, going in other areas. And so what happened? Someone is speaking of food law as something which started just at the starting of this century with the report on food safety of the Commission, and even with the Regulation 178 of 2002. In fact, this is not completely true in an historical perspective. Food law in Europe started to take its shape in the 60s with the first European agricultural regulation regarding to market, because they were finance, economic regulation, but also regulation giving definitions, olive oil, wine, and so on and so on. So the story is much longer than we imagine. Nowadays, we are facing even a new significant step. Agricultural lawyers started to speak about European communitarian, then European agricultural law, European food law. Nowadays, we think that we cannot speak anymore only about European food law. We are just speaking about European and global food law, not as a matter, you know, of trend, fashion. It is nice to speak about a global world, but just as a technical consideration. I will try taking a few minutes to give you some relevant point with reference to specific rules, specific hard rules, and we will discuss later about soft and hard rules. And what is going on? International agreements, of course, they are playing a big role, but this is not the only part of global food law. Together with these international agreements, we have a lot of recommendations by organizations like OIV regarding the wine, like Codex Alimentarius, which is not regarding only food safety, but even food quality, food communication, food labeling, and so on. And even by other strange organizations, like the United Nations Organization for Europe. We discovered a few years ago this organization. I must admit, when I was a student, nobody never spoke to me. And in this organization, there are still the old Soviet Union, Azerbaijan, Tajikistan, and so on. It is one of these international organizations created after the Second World War, before setting up the wall. And they adopt recommendations. But the point is that this sort of recommendations are, in most cases, binding, and they are becoming hard law. So what is going on? There is another relevant point. Contamination among legal system, legal transparency. I don't want to go outside my border and my competence and go within areas which are very well, organized regarding legal transplants. But we mentioned together with Matteo and Umberto, of course, the teaching and the words from Canfro and from Watson about what is the matter and what we intend for legal transplants. In fact, it is something which is in the story of the comparative law science, and we are nowadays looking legal transplants much more than we imagined. I think everybody in this room knows what is ACCP. ACCP is the hazard control method of critical control point. Has been introduced in Europe, starting from Aula legal system in 1993. Has been adopted in the United States with the new Food Safety Modernization Act only a few years ago. And a very distinguished colleague, Neil Fortin, came to speak in Milano because, you know, what I forgot to say, but it is in the program, this meeting is the third of a series. We met in Piacenza, we met even in Milano with other foreign colleagues, thinking and discussing about tools and trends of global food law. And in that occasion, he said, you know, we in the United States adopted the ACCP method, which has been later adopted by Europe. I told Neil, I appreciate very much your work, but it was adopted in Europe 20 years before the United States, but not for a chauvinistic attitude, but just to say, maybe I'm guilty, I don't know, but just to say that legal answers, and this is something which in some way Martin Olle, I imagine, will discuss in his speech later, possible legal answers to problems which are even more similar as much as the world is connected are adopted by other systems. So not only through formal exchange, treaties, lists, WTO, and so on. There is all that part, but there is this other part. So what is going on and what are the relevant points that we see? From one side, the role still played in European food legislation by the common agricultural policy. The legal basis of most of the rules adopted with reference to food are to be found and are declared to be found in the article of the European Treaty that puts and sets the goals of the common agricultural policy. Like, for example, having enough to eat or food security, the strategy that a professor spoke before. So it is not a relic of the past. And when we speak, and we will listen with great pleasure to the speech of Professor Pardolesi on the new proposals of the regulation, I don't know if the word is the right one, within the agri-food market. But the basis of that regulation also, it is adopted going on the common agricultural policy. But even the basis, and I was just speaking with our Canadian colleagues a few minutes ago, of PDO and PGI is adopted on the basis of common agricultural policy. Another point, very important, sources of law. I just had the chance yesterday coming back to see later some old papers, one of Alessandro Pizzorusso on the sources of law, and another one, of course, of many years before, of Gino Gorla on the Lex Ali Loci and Lex of other Loci. And you find even example of all of this today within our role. I will give you only a very few examples just to say that this is not only, how to say, a personal way of looking to these problems, but it is something which is deeply rooted within European law. If we look to the Common Market Organization, the CMO organization, the regulation on the unique CMO of 2007, this unique regulation says that the Commission shall adopt technical rules. We listened this morning to a very nice speech about the powers of the Commission, taking into account the standard recommendations adopted by United Nations, European Commission for Europe UNECE or by OIV or by Codex Alimentarius. I agree, taking in account is not giving directly effect, but if you are not taking in account, that could be something that could be questioned and discussed before, of course, with not respecting that. Secondly, much more important, regarding enological practices, the Commission, under the regulation regarding the enological practices, is entitled to adopt technical regulation. But doing this, the Commission shall base itself on the enological practices recommended and published by the International Organization WILD. But, and I'm taking this one as the last one, because I work a lot on the wine rules, and have been very surprised when I discovered this, that there is a regulation of the Commission going back to 2009, accepting some enological practices, and stating that if there is no rule specifically adopted by the Commission, enological practices recommended by the OIV will be accepted as such as accepted in Europe. So, what is this? Is a sort of introduction by delegation, of which kind, we just don't know. And if you want to go just to the basic regulation 178, the definition of food, food is everything which anyone can take himself, but there is a distinction with medicine, there is distinction with other things, and in all these cases the distinction is based on European directives, except with reference to drugs. The difference with drugs, and I intend drugs not as medicine but as cocaine and so on, is on the basis of the definition of the United Nations Convention on Drugs of 1957. Europe never signed that convention, and that convention has been changed many times. So that United Nations Convention is directly operating, in that case I'm sure, as hard law in our, and so a judge which is called in Italy to decide a case and to decide if we have food or different things is that. So what is the conclusion? A young colleague from United Kingdom who studied in the University of Florence wrote a nice book speaking about hybridization of food safety governance, just speaking about the role of private rules, not so soft as they can appear, but in most cases very binding in this. So what is the result of this? What is the reason why we invited, and I just strongly want to thank all of them to be here, some colleagues from other countries of Europe or other countries much far from Europe, that this peculiar structure of agri-food law as a sort of laboratory requires new tools, which we cannot find in the traditional tools of the legal scientists, like general, special, rural exception. And so the answer to go back to the comparative method seemed to all of us as the natural answer. And Maitland used to say that comparison involves history. And Gino Gola said, if history involves comparison, comparison involves history. So we think, I think all of us having experience in this area, that food law cannot be, if it is not a global, not only European food law, and it is a global comparative law. So thank you again for your attention, and thanks to our distinguished colleague. I don't want to take other times. Thank you very much. And so in this direction, we have been strongly forced to reserve the first position to a well-known comparative lawyer like Professor Paolo Lesi, who will discuss with us about antitrust and business-to-business transactions in the agri-food supply chain. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Once upon a time, which is a quite dramatic way of getting started, but nonetheless, once upon a time, which was, I believe, 40 years ago, I was about to publish my book on distribution contracts, and then I had the idea and which was shared by most people, that verticality to be built and possibly shaped after the format of distribution contracts in a world which was centered upon industry, let's say. So I'm in a maverick in this place as of now, since I am in the country yard and I'm not very familiar. And I'm trying as of now to imagine that there is a possibility to reread this kind of experience in a different way. I will be extremely fast on that, but let me, since we need some history and an historical background in order to have a decent idea. So verticality was mainly shaped after the distribution contract, which was obviously a one-way relationship in our way of conceiving this kind of stuff. So it was a relationship from an upstream market to a downstream market, and franchising was the polar star of this kind. Well, franchising was coming from the US, was something which was really featuring, when coming to Europe, some kind of ambiguity. In fact, in the US, franchising is the equivalent of our distribution contracts, whereas we have even in Italy created a special statutory intervention about franchise law, since franchising should be something different, which is not, but that's another story. It was also possible, even at the time, to conceive of the possibility that the relationship could go the opposite direction. Walmart, for instance, or Sears, and so on and so forth, giant trader, the driving people on the side of retailing. But it was rare and was considered, in a sense, marginal. Nonetheless, over time, buyer power emerged. And it was not so striking at the time, since there was a bit of confusion. On the one hand, the buyer power might mean monopsony, and as an alternative, the concept of bargaining in the market with a limited number of retailers. So an alternative. Monopsony was already a problem, since obviously from an economic standpoint, the idea would be that monopoly and monopsony makes really no difference, since distortion is over the former and distortion is obviously happens with the second. But the way the economic crew has analyzed, canvassed the possibility of monopoly has been in a sense confusing, since it is obvious that if you do not look at a monopsony as a platform, which is important for Laura, I imagine, but you think of a monopsony just operating in toward the upstream market, then you see that there is the strong buyer who is capable to get lower prices. And if you imagine that this kind of advantage of benefit can be passed on consumers, then a monopsonist might be welcome. There is something wrong in that, and the expectation that lower prices will translate in better opportunities for consumers is possibly misleading. And later analysis suggested that possibly monopsony might be really joined to a perspective of dual monopoly, resulting in a double retractation in a final supply, which is obviously from an economic standpoint unacceptable. But once we drop the idea of monopsony and focus on the marginal but increasing phenomenon of buyer power, then you find the new dimension. But the new dimension, one more time, is industrial, in my opinion, from my standpoint, since what is coming really to the surface is the power of hypermarkets, supermarkets, and large retailers giant traders, and so on and so forth. So we have buyer power as bargaining strength, which goes obviously beyond monopoly in a much more dispersed, fragmented reality, and yet with a strong leverage because of the possibility of the giant traders to immediately switch to other suppliers, to credibly threaten to vertically integrate, and so just jump beside the suppliers and possibly sponsor upstream expansion or, why not, entry. And on the other hand, if you look at the industrial side, then you discover the supermarket offer a number of advantages, both to supplier and consumers. And I won't make any comment on that, but obviously you can think of economies of scale and scope. Large retailers are capable of extracting better opportunities and can solve a lot of problems for consumers as far as search cost. Well, I've been studying in Chicago with George Stigler, and search costs were really a focal point of his analysis. So he got a Nobel Prize, and I will follow his steps on this point. So there is a lot of suggestive stuff deriving from the entry and massive penetration of supermarkets and the like, but there we see that something is happening. They're manifesting a kind of power which triggers practices highly debatable: slotting allowances, category management, private label products, and as an antitrust scholar, I would say that even today the antitrust relevance of these practices is really utterly controversial, let's say. But if this is true, now we come to a phenomenon which over time has witnessed the emergence of B2B unfair trading practices in the retail supply chain. And this kind of phenomenon can be read in two ways: as a market failure and a legal failure. I will be very short on the first part, which is an economic interpretation, but it's really extremely important in order probably to derive a frame for a better understanding of the legal crisis that we will focus on in a while. So, market failure. Market failure, since in a competitive market where there is no transaction cost, that were, according to the view of Ronald Coase, who was one of my teachers in Chicago, but he bears no responsibility for my speaking here. Just forget it, he was really big genius. Okay, in a competitive market with complete information, no transaction cost at all, one-sidedness would be immediately punished by, in terms of voting with the feet. The market would register necessarily a kind of exit, and more or less, in economic analysis, which I won't consider as of now, the reality tells an entirely different story. So Ronald Coase and his ideal world is over there. No transaction costs are ubiquitous. And what happens so is that buyer power, as of now, is skyrocketing. As far as I know, well, I'm not an expert, but I've been told, and anyway, I read somewhere, that in the last 3 decades, more or less, 110 buying desks operated in the whole European landscape for the majority of food bought in Europe. No more than 110 buying desks, as against more or less 3 million producers of food, which is being sold for 3/4 in Europe. So it is so clear that there is a disproportion between the concentration of the buying power and so on the demand and the offer, which obviously triggers a critical situation. Italy is no exception. There are huge cooperatives, aggregation, there are second-degree aggregation, central purchasing entities, bodies, groups, and large private retailers. None of them counts for more than 20%. Even the co-op organization doesn't count for more than 20%, which means that nobody's really controlling the market. And so the basic idea, so controversial as you like it, of dominance in the market is really far away. And we should take care of this point. Now, first, so we have a problem. We have those unfair trade practices, UTPs, I will call them UTPs. It's an awful acronym, but we will content with that. In order to save time, but the taxonomy is really devastating. I have really spent a lot of time in order to make all the sources converge and have a taxonomy. So as of now, I dispose of the best taxonomy, I believe, all over the world, since I collected a list. Should I read it? Well, it takes 5 minutes maybe, and if I comment on that, I will be really done with my speech. But nonetheless, we have more or less two broad categories in this taxonomy. Obstructive UTPs that may be both pre-contractual or operated during the contractual phase. And so we have boycotts, there, denial of business, which more or less is the reverse of the duty to deal, discrimination, obstruction of sales, predatory pricing, use of rebates and bonuses. I won't comment on that. All of them are more classical in a sense. Use of rebates and bonuses, unusual contractual restrictions, and most favored customers clauses, which is one of the best favorite theme in the present antitrust analysis. And then we have ambiguous contract terms, more or less imposing additional obligations on the weaker party, lack of written contracts, since if you don't have an instrument with black letters, it's obviously easier to rewrite and to reinvent and to reshape the discipline of the relationship ex post. And that was the first part and the first entry, obstructive UTPs. Then we have exploitative UTPs. We are really at a loss when we deal with the abuse of dominance with the letter A of Article 102 of the treaty. And, but since it is difficult for us to conceive of the price as an unfair price and so on, so all this kind of stuff, and then we come to this field and we find a lot of practices like most of them post-contractual, which is an additional difficulty with respect to the first category, no? Since we have then requests for unreasonably low purchase price, retroactive contract changes, such as deduction from the invoiced amount to cover promotion fees or something like that, undue transfer of commercial risks that should pertain to one operator and are transferred. So responsibility, for instance, for stolen goods, something like that, or losses incurred, and so on and so forth. Unfair use of information, withholding information, or stealing information, unfair termination, which is obvious. And then we come to the Italian discipline, so delay of more than 30 days in paying perishable goods, revocation of orders of perishable goods with short time of announcement, when it's really too late in order to reorganize. And then the possibility that supplier is requested to pay for waste without being responsible for it, the supplier being requested for the payment for stocking, slotting goods, and so on, so suppliers being requested payment for promoting sales, and what else? For costs of commercialization, and you see, this is a complicated taxonomy. There are possibly overlapping among the various entries, but the list is seriously impressive. Now, all of them derive from imbalancing of bargaining power and economic dependence, which might emerge, obviously, in a way or the other, on both sides, the supply and of the supply chain. For some products and services, we can imagine that there is prevalence of suppliers, whereas in other circumstances the reverse holds true. Now, bargaining power manifests itself whenever, that's the point, since we are going, this is the final track that we derive from a cursory economic analysis. No dominance, no way of considering the situation in terms of monopsony, but we should only consider the difference in bargaining power, and so counterpower that exists whenever one party holds a better alternative to the negotiated agreement, which is the so-called BATNA, in the words of Jan Eers and Nabelov. So the BATNA is possibly the economic key in order to, and the BATNA depends on several factors that I cannot analyze, but they mostly are switching costs. They are barrier to exit, transaction-specific investments without no possibility of recouping in a short time what you have invested, so that there are some costs, info asymmetries, and incompleteness of contracts, strategic behavior after the contract, reshaping execution or triggering renegotiation, or if you want, simply speaking, blackmail. And time factor, obviously dealing with perishables and seasonable goods. Fear factor, which is the common feature of all these kind of situation. For instance, the listing, the référencement of a central d'achat in France means that the supplier won't exist. Overnight, it will be really devastated simply because of the listing, which is a way of punishing the non-acceptance of an unfair request and something like that. What else? And final stroke, difficulty of accessing justice, which is a problem for lawyers. Now, here we are. And we are to the lawyering part of the story, which should be the most interesting for me. Let me say that there are two approaches. The first is centered upon the phenomenon. So the phenomenon itself, UTPs, unfair trade practices, B2Bs obviously, and so canvassing the legislative and soft law armory in order to find remedies. So this is a perspective which I would call militant. And the alternative is considering the whole discipline of agri-food markets as a single body and trying to figure out that there is a multifunctionality of competition law. That's my idea. I would prefer this one, since it's in a sense closer to my sensitivity and is less militant than the former. So that I would like to imagine that the whole thing should stay in a comprehensive picture of law of competition, no longer intended as exclusive consideration of the antitrust stuff, but also considering every other complementarity and possible alliance, something like that. So the first thing that we should consider is that both Article 101, for reasons that I won't discuss right now, but quite evident, and above all, Article 1 or 2 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union cannot really help. The preconditions for their working do not obtain. So rare dominance and not even necessarily abused, so forget about it. We have to necessarily move to some stricter competition discipline. That's the point. Actually, so we might, for instance, if I refer to the Italian situation, I will focus on Article 9 of the law number 192 of 1998, and so the abuse of economic dependence. And with its tail, which is Article 62 of the decree number 1, the law decree. Law decree? Law decree, okay. Law decree number 1, 2012, which more or less fit in European panorama. At the very beginning, there was the German experience that already in paragraph 20 introduced the idea of Marktmacht Unternehmen. And paragraph 2, the Abhängigkeit as the parameter for evaluating the relative dominance, which is more or less corresponding to the idea of an imbalance in contractual power. So we are not really focusing on the market, but controlling the contract relationship as a single cell operating in the market, something like that. It was the GVB, the German experience, to have the lead, and then there was the French evolution. The French evolution, which I cannot really go through since I am already running out of time. No. Are you sure?
Sure.
Don't kill me. So, well, it's his fault. I bear no responsibility.
Go on.
I would try to run as fast as possible, but if I go... the French experience has been, in a sense, extremely overcrowded, since they were already focusing on a kind of relative dominance in Article 80 of the original Ordonnance 1, 2, 4, 6, was it the original one? And then they introduced the Loi Galland in 1996, and then they reshaped the Code of Commerce in 2001. So the Article 442, 6, which has been further elaborated by the Loi Dutrey. Well, it's a long story, as you can see, since there has been an additional intervention by the Loi Châtel of 2008, and focusing on the modernization of the agricultural and the fishery discipline, the Loi number 874 of 2010, and then we had let's call it modernization of the Code Napoleon, so the remake of the reform of the Code Napoleon, after really shouting against the doing business story and the World Bank greed and so on and so forth. Then the French decided to change their monument. And the position for that, the comment for that was that so the French law will be more acceptable, more friendly for foreigners. Actually, so we have, as of now, Article 1171, which portrays the significant imbalance in addition contracts, and Article 1143, which has been modified further in April 2018, with the fundamental idea of abuse of economic dependence as economic violence. Well, you see, so there is a widespread experience, let's say, vertical experience, which is, in a sense, restricting the focus from the market to the underlying contract as a small piece of the market, but possibly transferring the same kind of experience. And I would call it a development and a way of filling the very many gaps of the antitrust discipline, which has been so strongly important to turn out to be marginal, since nobody cares unless you are named Google or something like that. But nobody else would care. And this kind of discipline, on the contrary. Now, there are three problems, or I will touch upon them in a very cursory way. The first is, what are we talking about precisely? For instance, if we stay in Italy and consider Article 62, which has been supplemented by a ministerial decree a few months ago, afterwards, and has been further complicated with adding some entries which I already consider in the long-lasting taxonomy I was focusing on before. So which is the relationship between Article 9 on the abuse of economic dependence and Article 62? And the answer is, well, I would like to be optimistic on that. Article 9 has been a failure. I've counted since 1998, I've counted 120 decisions in Italy, a decent number, I would say, but very few really effective. So has been really enforced in a bunch of cases, which at the end of the day implies that the abuse of economic dependence story has been, practically speaking, a mishap. So that Article 62, despite its local, let's say parochial, yes, I would say, despite its parochial feeling, let's say, is an instrument which might be more biting and so more effective. I'm not sure about that, since the story of its enforcement too short. The three attempts, as so far, by the Italian competition authority, well, scaled down to one condemnation, is almost insignificant, I would say, but nonetheless is still there as a symptom of a remedy which might possibly work. But then, I won't go through the analysis of Article 62 and its recombination, which might be nonetheless interesting. Let me just remind you that the perspective is extremely parochial. But then, what happens? Then we have the proposal of directive. The proposal of directive, the number 173 final of April. Huh? Yeah. Well, Professor Albisini is scolding me for using the Italian translation. He's suggesting that is most of the sense of the proposed directive has been lost in translation. But
it is.
And I would believe him. And it's my fault, since I'm lazy enough and I didn't go to the original document, and I content myself with the translation in order to do it. Well, but nonetheless, to comment, as a minimum, the directives promises more than it delivers, since some practices are only prohibited with respect to perishable goods, which means that the scope of the prohibition, when there is a prohibition, since you have this kind of gymnastic between Article 3.1, letter A, Article 3.1, letter B, 2, D, and so on and so forth. So there is a limited number of prohibition. And then there is a more important checklist of practices that might be prohibited unless they are stated in a clear way and in advance. And some UTPs are not prohibited at all. So we have a proposal which, in a sense, is delusive, let me say. Sorry about that, but I think it's delusive, and from another standpoint, practically speaking, redundant. I'm coming to the point. If instead of cherry-picking among the various possibilities deriving from the several fields we have going through. So if you obviously adopt a fragmented view, and then you pick up from competition law, and then you consider unfair competition law as a separate discipline, and then you consider contract law, why not, in order to rescue the abuse of economic dominance and so on and so forth, then you may have the impression that everything turns out to be useful. But this is probably, in a sense, tells a story of repetita juvent. Repetita juvent, in a sense, say them more often than you can, and they will come true, which is the idea of post-truth, you know, no? Post-truth. And if that's the first point, just say that it is so and will be so. And so if you say in several places the same story, or more or less the same story, then you will have a stronger story. I don't believe it. This is not good legal practice, and legislative practice, in my opinion. And what else? From another standpoint, let me say that this adds confusion to confusions. We are already dealing with the problem of the multi-level sourcing of our law, which is no longer our domestic law, and forget about it, okay? But it's not even, as of now, it's going to be global, possibly, and with a lot of contamination, so that we are already dealing with a mess, let me say, a serious mess. And so my impression is most of the criticisms about the way the law stands as of now is more or less captured by an evaluation. We are dealing with a liquid law. Let's take Bauman saying, okay, liquid law, which in my opinion comes very close to liquefied law. And this is, yes, but liquefied, I would imply even something else. But liquefied law means that we are really at a loss. And as a scholar, I would like to oppose this view. And well, there was a final chapter, but since a final chapter was devoted to the possibility that this kind, in addition to being superfluous, redundant, and since, let me say, let's consider the old dichotomy between antitrust law and unfair competition law, then all this stuff is already there in the general clause of unfair competition. We don't need anything else. We need only a legal crew which is capable of making this kind of provision work. Repetita juvent is really a way of surrendering, of dropping our credibility as scholars, as legal operators, and so on and so forth. So this is already a problem. With complication. There is an article by Victoria Daskalova, who is following the tracks of some scholars about regulations and the possibility that regulations, too much regulation is counterproductive. And so in addition to being possibly redundant from a scholarly standpoint, this kind of discipline might be even counterproductive for several reasons. One that I will discuss in the next life, let's say, which is better than the next opportunity, is that this kind of discipline is conflicting with precisely the common markets operation. Is it common market? And the PAC also. And the PAC also, since the PAC, let me say, this is the last statement, I promise. Already there is a critical point on that, remember. Well, Article 43, Paragraph 6, relating to Article 39, they already introduce a strong deviation from the general discipline of antitrust, since they adopt the rationale of countervailing power, possibly. So the producers' organization and association of producer organization are exempted from the application and so forth. This kind of regulation is possibly provoking a backfire against this kind of particular status being recognized in favor of agricultural producers. I would be extremely cautious on that. Thank you for your attention.
I think all of us are really grateful to Professor Pardolesi for his, how to say, provocative approach, coming among agriculture, before then food lawyers, and saying, okay, we do not need rules. Of course, working on this topic only could take a couple of days, and it is really an interesting point. I just wanted only to give one element for any further discussion later. This proposal, nowadays before the European Parliament, has not been presented on the basis of the antitrust regulation. It has been presented using as legal basis the rules regarding common agricultural policy. And there has been a big debate before the Parliament on which is the Commission, the Parliamentary Commission, which is in charge for this. And finally, the Parliament voted by majority that the competence was the Agricultural Policy Commission. So this is the first point, which is really interesting for us, because I just have taken a lot of points. Only 110 buyers in Europe against 3 million sellers. So the trouble what is, and Professor Pardolesi put at our attention the not significant role played by Article 62 of the so-called Decreto Monti. I say to the foreign colleagues, this is a rule introduced by the Italian government a few years ago, establishing a specific provisions for, it's not clear, food products or agri-food products. A judge in Rome, the administrative court, said this is not any food products, but only agri-food products. It does not apply to Ferrero or to Coca-Cola. But the matter is that after that bad, how to say, decree from the ministry, there has been also adoption of rules by the Italian antitrust authority that said, I will apply these rules not as an already defined set of rules, but only when I see there is any violation of competition rules. That means that rules are of no effect at all, because if there is a violation of anti-competition rules, we do not need any special rules. So I agree on this point, not others, but on this point I agree totally with friend Roberto. But what is happening today in Europe, I just don't want to take too much time, but this is a very, how to say, relevant point, is that the European Parliament, after many years, and after many scholars, and after many political groups or stakeholders that said there is no reason to give specific rules to agriculture and food products, nowadays is going back to the origin of the treaty and saying that rule that we have in the treaty justifies specific rules. And I just went to see what is going on now. It's not speaking about if there is any violation of anti-competition rules. There is a list of unfair trading practices which are prohibited by themselves. I don't want to take too much your time and attention. I'm sorry. I think we can have later on the discussion.
Just
Sure. No, but
only let me add, since there is a point which I ignored, but the European effort is an attempt to harmonize, which is important anyway.
Sure.
Let me say
sure.
that.
No. It's totally clear, and of course it is as a directive with an attempt to harmonize, giving back the ball to the member states. So we will see what our member states will do. So after this very interesting discussion, may I introduce now our colleagues coming from very far, from Shanghai, from the University of Shanghai, the ECOS Law School. The ECOS Law School is a very well respected and well-known law school which works especially on the areas of food and drug regulation. And I must say, if we go back to the starting point of this afternoon, that if we look in comparison to very large efforts that food lawyers and even food regulators have made in China during these years, really we become astonished by their capacity to work so hard and have such results. The two colleagues are Ruan Zanlin, he is director of the ECOS Food and Drug Regulatory Research Center, and Yu Yang Yao, I apologize for my pronunciation, professor at the law school. And they will speak on a topic which is of specific interest for us and very well connected to the speech of Professor Pardolesi, because they are speaking about small farmers and what is the situation of small farmers in big market. Just to remind to all of you that when ACCP method has been introduced in Europe in 1993, the great fear of small producers was it is too difficult. It is only for large, big companies. Nowadays, we understood that ACCP is a sort of personal responsibility and personal consciousness. It's looking more to the consciousness of the operators. So even small producers can play a role. So we will listen with great interest to your speech. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Albertini, for your very kind introduction. We are particularly honored to have been invited to speak at this conference. My mother language is Chinese. Today, I try to speak in English. So I hope everybody can accept my speak. Now I'm going to present the work that we have been interested for a long time. The title of my presentation is Small Farm, Big Market, and Agriculture Production. I'll lay my stress on the 4 or 5 aspects. The rise of the question. As most agricultural products are perished, nearly all countries face a common problem, that is the difficulty of selling agricultural products. Adopted rural household contract responsible system, China faces more difficult on the problem. As a tool and a platform, e-commerce based on internet and Internet of Things has provided new channel and a new model for the sale of agricultural products. Selling agricultural products on e-commerce platform become the most economical, convenient, and effective. which make it possible for small firms to connect direct with larger market. So e-commerce platform agricultural product can be delivered direct to the dinner table of resident, which omits the step of processing, transportation, storage, wholesale and retail, and so on. And this sale model, the traditionally from farm to fork, entail supervision on food quality and safety has changed. Supervision can only be carried out in the two links, firm and fork. This is the supervision of these two links constitute the whole supervision of agricultural products safety. Therefore, how to ensure the quality and the safety of agricultural products and to improve the efficiency of its supervision are the new question which was studied. Small-scale peasant economy is the basic model of China, traditional agricultural production. It is still and will be the main mode of agricultural production and management in China in the next 30 years. Characterized by decentralized, it takes firmly as the basic unit to carry out agricultural production after the implementation of the household contract responsibility system. It combines agriculture with household handicraft industry and belongs to the natural economy. Take self-sufficiency as the purpose of production. Decades after this implementation of the rural household contract responsibility system, China's agricultural production efficiency has been greatly enhanced, and the commercialization of agricultural production has also been improved accordingly. This how to steer the surplus agricultural product to increasing the income of agricultural production is an important problem faced by millions of households in rural area. It is also an urgent problem for Chinese government in the way of developing rural area and raising farmers' income. Thanks to the development of the Internet and Internet of Things technology, a new path has been found for solve the difficulty of selling agricultural products, which integrate the traditionally small-scale production into the bigger markets. Traditionally, sales of fresh agricultural products were constricted by geographic factors. Small farmers used to sell their supplies agriculture production in the street or in the nearby village fair, like this. Big firm had to go through many intermediary links such as broker, ledger, wholesale, and retail if they wanted to sell their agricultural products to market in other places. But small firms were unable to profit by the sale mode with multi-intermediary links. Consequently, larger quantity of surplus agricultural products was wasted. An e-commerce platform makes it possible to deliver fresh products from field direct to dinner table. Changes the firm to supermarket model. It links firms directly to consumers, which not only shorten the distance between firms and consumers, but also reduce circulation links and costs. Small firms are able to sell their agricultural products to all parts of the country with only click of a mouse. Products that need to stay fresh, such as seasoned vegetable and fruits, for dairy products and eggs, can also be sold directly nationwide through e-commerce platform. In this way, small firms enter into big markets, which to some extent solve the difficulty of selling agricultural products. A variety of agricultural products with regionally characterization can be found on the famous e-commerce platform like Tianmao and Jingdong, and so on. Online sales are changing the sales mode of agricultural products rapidly. China's online retail sales of agricultural products exceed 150 billion yuan in 2015 and reached 125 trillion yuan in 2017, which creates jobs for 28 million persons. So this is a very good way. However, online sales bring about benefit as well as quality concern that deserve our attention. According to the principle of territorial management and level-by-level responsibility, China's supervision system over the quality and safety of agricultural products is carried out by the Agriculture Department and follow a double rhythm supervision and inspection mechanism, which means selecting the inspecting object randomly and appointing the supervision randomly. Nevertheless, the traditionally regulatory measures are applied mainly to larger farmers. As for the small farmer that skate over, it is impossible for the regulatory outlet to put them under supervision. In addition, before the e-commerce emerged, the agricultural products produced by small farmers were often for their own consumption. And even if some small farmers had supplied agricultural products, they are usually sold them in counterfeit trade market, where people know each other. This it was also unnecessary to bring small farmers into supervision. By applying centralized and large-scale agricultural production methods, larger farmers make the quality and safety of their agricultural products traceable from the cultivation, processing, and the transportation period to the sale and consumption period. With the help of e-commerce, the agricultural products are sold direct from small farmer to consumer. So the supervision over the quality and safety of the agricultural products becoming focused on the cultivation and consumption period. Due to the attribution of coincidence goods and experience goods of agricultural products, consumers have not yet the ability and the method to test the safety of them. Therefore, the supervision over the quality and safety of agricultural products sold on e-commerce platform is actually concentrated on the cultivation period. If the agricultural products are safe in the period, they are safe for consumers. Otherwise, they are unsafe. As a result, the responsibility of ensure the agricultural products safety undoubtedly fall on the regulatory outlet. Since this is no way for consumer to judge or change the safety of agricultural products purchased online. Faced with the new sale methods and small farmers, big markets, China's traditional supervision system over the quality and safety of agricultural products must be updated. Otherwise, once the quality of agricultural products loses guarantee, small farmer, big markets will not only lose the foundation for its extension and development, but also be unable to achieve the goal of solve the difficulty of selling agricultural products. Small farmers, big markets developed from internet technology. The problem caused by internet technology should also be solved in the industry with its development and improvement. Furthermore, since it is small farmers who are given the opportunity to deliver fresh products from field direct to dinner table by e-commerce, it is reasonable that small firms should account for ensure the quality and safety of agricultural products. So, innovation thinking is needed to enable small firms realize their obligation will enjoy the benefits brought to them by internet technology. We propose the following suggestions to ensure the quality and the safety of agricultural products produced by small firms. Firstly, to set the entering threshold of e-commerce platform. An e-commerce platform should require small firms to submit application for entering it, and then audit and record the applicant's basic information according to the access condition set by the regulatory authorities, so as to exclude the undesirable small firm from e-commerce platform. Besides, an e-commerce platform could also set up evaluation system to enable consumers to vote with their feet. Consumers can make good or bad comments and let with their for service. In this way, the self-adjustment of e-commerce market combines with the mechanism of government supervision. So the collaborative supervision system that coincides with the development future of the e-commerce can be brought into full play. Secondly, to strengthen the supervision on small farmers' agriculture inputs through internet, through checking and analyzing the data like the seeds, fertilizer, pesticides purchased by small farmers, the regulatory outlet can obtain the basic information about small farmers' cultivation of agricultural products. These, the agriculture inputs can be supervised precisely. Thirdly, to check the agricultural products sold by small farmers throughout the Internet of Things and big data, to analyze the data of consumers' evaluation on agricultural products on e-commerce platform, or to pay a return visit to the consumers according to the information recorded on e-commerce platform. Regulatory outlet can utilize the Internet to understand the consumers' acceptance of the quality of agricultural products. Meanwhile, they can also encourage and support both sides of the transaction to participate in e-commerce market governance, which promote the formation of the core governance model. Fourthly, to establish a traceable system of seed production, trading, and circulation on the basis of three methods: DNA identification for crop varieties, standardization for labels of agricultural products, and record for seed commissions, production, and sales. Fifthly, to build spots for quickly inspect agricultural products in order to provide timely and convenient assistance to consumers. If the quality of the agricultural product inspected is incorrect, having the problem like excess pesticide residues, having material pollution, etc., the consumer can upload the inspection result to e-commerce platform, which can enhance other consumers' risk awareness. Moreover, consumers can also make a claim for compensation with the small firm. To conclude, the development of small farmers' large market is based on the safety of agricultural products. Strengthening supervision over the cultivation of agricultural products is one of the crucial measures to ensure agricultural products safety. Traditionally, supervision mode is no longer suitable for today's sales model. So we should create the innovative supervision ideas, formulate various new supervision systems, and improve supervision mechanism with the help of technology like internet, big data, etc. This thank you.
Thank you very much. Really, I think on the side of everybody in this room, we have been really fascinated by this scenario. There is a lot of discussion today in Italy about e-commerce and about big players on e-commerce, like Amazon and so on. We had no idea of this possibility. And just to go back to the topics regarding market regulation, this is a scenario of a totally different market where agricultural producers, this is just for Professor Goldoni this morning, because we are speaking about agricultural fresh products which are arriving in the market with volumes that we listened a few minutes ago, which are really impressive. And of course, this forces the research from the Chinese authorities, from the Chinese colleagues, of very new approaches. And if someone says that European food law started with the food law crisis, food safety crisis, BSE, and so on, and what about this new reaction to this big innovation? This is a very big innovation from the side of supply chain, which reacts with the existing rules. And I just wanted to mention to you that European legislation, in some way, maybe not completely conscious, is taking into account these new developments. You know, the new regulation of last year, which will enter in application next year, on official control on food, among other many new things, and I invite you to read on the 2 numbers ago of the Rivista Diritto alimentare, a contribution of comments on this. But among other things, introduce a globalization of control and a cooperation among authorities within Europe, but even outside Europe, with a single rating system on any producer. So something which is very similar to the experience that they are in some way putting on. And this European register with rating on any single producer will be full of dates coming from all over the world, even from China. So thank you again. I must say, I was really astonished. I didn't know this new experience, and I think this is something which even in the European regulation of agriculture and food market, we must look then. And now we are going, and just to have a confirmation of the importance of the comparative method, even to study our own law. So now, Professor Martin Cloutier, de la Université du Québec à Montréal, he will speak on topics which are very near to our experience and even to our sensitivity, if I may use this word, and which is motivation, issues and prospects for Quebec terroir product innovations, from local actions to global markets. The word local, global comes always, and I will ask you to introduce you shortly and then to expose. Thank you very much.
Hello. Okay. Good afternoon. I would like to thank Professor Izzi and Professor Ferrari for having me here, coming all the way from Montreal to be with you and give this small talk. So my first disclaimer, I'm a full professor in management, so I don't teach law and I have no formal background in law. So that's the first disclaimer. So to be sure that your hopes are remaining realistic and at the right level for a non-legal expert. I've been conducting work for the past few years. I'll show you some of it related to cider. And 10 years ago and more about champagne with a colleague in France. And things are moving very fast at home regarding PGIs and PDOs and all these kinds of things, which is unusual for a North American place. So there's perhaps many motivations for this. And what my colleagues have asked me to do is just to provide an overview of what's happening. And given your conception of the world about these things, that may spur some interesting insights and discussions on your part. So this is the outline for the talk. First, I'll provide an overview, some background, then talk about some issues that this is raising, and talk about a little bit regarding the legal framework and some of the products that are what we call reserve designations, and two involving cases that I would like to bring to your attention, and then I'll have some concluding remarks. The Quebec government has put together a legal framework back in the 90s, but the one that we're operating under is established in 2006, and it's related to agri-food related protection of IP to manage and valorize innovation. So somehow the Ministry of Agriculture is involved, but also the Ministry of Finance. And reserve designation and protected geographic indications as a means to protect link with elements that you're familiar with, such as product specificity, methods of production, or terroir dimensions of products, which may sound very peculiar for Europeans. And then certifications. Now, Quebec is the only one such framework for food in North America. And given the program that the government has put in place in the previous budget, there's a lot of work for people involved into the 2018-2021 period, given the interests in these kinds of institutional frameworks. So, While the legal framework may be a strong impetus for product innovation, IP protection and the structuring of producer groups in achieving high-quality standards, there's a value-driven and governance element to it as well, which is not really examined except maybe by management scholar. So the questions we are interested in are collective governance aspects, issues, and markets, and as well as the international dimension. Is it within reach? Because part of the motivation for having a PDO or PGI will be to be able to export and have your product being recognized by international institutions as well, much more than for the local market. So just to give you a little bit of a flavor for what we can find, this is CAR-TV is the government body that manages that process. It's Conseil des appellations réservées et des termes valorisants. And you can go and read that on the web. And these are the different frameworks under which you can get reserve designations. So you can have one related to production mode, for example, bio. Therefore, a whole bunch of products will fall under this umbrella. Then you can have the reserve designation related to the specificity relative to a product in the same category. Therefore, we will see what are such products, for example, sweet corn. And you can have some related to terroir, for example, production region, where the product is from, or a product that is intrinsic to the place. And you'll see such products, so that gives you a feel for what's going on in Quebec. Well, one of them is related to lamb born and raised in the Charlevoix region, and it is raised in sheep barn from birth until the end of its fattening. So some characteristics of that, it's the region, it's the diet, it's all sorts of elements that provide the characteristics and refer to the terms of reference in terms of raising those kinds of animals, and this is the logo that you'll find. So I'll say more about when I wrap this up. Here's one I know a little bit more about. This is a Quebec Ice Cider. You may have heard of it. This is the southern Quebec area. This is a map of where cider permits are located. There could be a whole much more interesting story to be told from the point of view of production permits to be told, but this is beyond and not the scope of this talk, but for some other day. So ice cider has to be made from naturally frozen either apple juice or picking up harvest winter apples on the trees when it's below certain temperatures, and the fruit being exposed to the weather conditions, the freezing, the unfreezing, the wind, the snow, and so on, will create the perfect mix for generating what you need because of sugar concentrations. Now, this one was awarded in 2014. So as you can see, those are very recent things happening, and essentially giving the act of respecting reserve designation and added value claims, PGI, Quebec Ice Cider recognition, aims to protect its authenticity and geographical name. So the use of designation is now reserved for products certified according to designation's specification manual, okay? So for those of you who don't know, Quebec Ice Cider is a product whose origin, specificity, and reputation stems from the Quebec province. It's a creation that has happened around the turn of the 1990s. And the product is the result of combination of three factors: characteristics related to the history of apple production in Quebec, the subsequent development of cider production, and the innovation consisting of concentrating the sugars in the apple and juice using the natural cold. Of course, that product's been copied in many places around the world, but that's the only place where it's done using the natural cold, and therefore you have to attest to the terms of reference in order for justifying that this works. Similarly, on about the same time, the Quebec ice wine, of course, it comes originally from Europe and Germany, I think, more specifically. But the Quebec ice wine has acquired also a reputation of its own. The fruits, you see when you have the cold, the wind, the low air humidity, and freeze-thaw cycle, cause natural dying of grapes, which allow their water to evaporate and concentrates the sugar and aromates and so on. So this is, again, because of the natural situation related to climate. And as a result, it allows one grower in the province to comply with federal regulation, which stipulates that ice wine is a wine that must be made exclusively from grapes naturally frozen on the vine. So this is another example. This one is less known. It's called the Canadian cow cheese. So this is a cow that was imported from Normandy and Brittany by the first French settlers. And essentially, this breed is disappearing. However, it has some nice characteristics to make different types of high-quality cheese. And they're trying to revive the process by which this is becoming a more value-added product and brings some contents to the process. Then you may have heard the maïs sucré de Neuville, which is a Neuville sweet corn. Now, sweet corn is grown all over the place in southern Quebec during the summer. And that place, though, has a special history and a reputation dating back to the 1950s. And there's a fine crop field management adapted to typical microclimate of Neuville. So we see that this particular sweet corn also received the PGI element. So this is the framework. These are some examples. And we want to know, is everything nice in this world? And we'll have some elements related to that. Many of these PGIs, once they've been created, for many producer groups, this is like a major achievement because you have to apply for it, you have to sustain the process, you have to have public consultations, it takes years, and eventually you have the Minister of Agriculture recognizing, based on recommendation, that this is a particular product that deserves a reserve designation. However, myself and many other researchers think that it's not the end of the process, but it's probably the beginning of the story when the day that you have that confirmation. Why? Because producers get awarded that possibility, and now they have actually to make it live. So that means they have to produce output, they have to get that collective business of managing a PGI going, and they have to valorize it as intended as part of the process. Now, of course, if you're familiar, you know that there are certification processes, that you have auditing, you have inspections, you have to report what you're doing. However, it costs a lot of money, and many of these producers, they want to have the PGI, but they would like to avoid the costs of it. Now, there are issues that come forefront of this, which is first to make the product known to consumers, because we're talking about products that may have been around for 10, 15 so years in their particular actual form, and consumers don't necessarily know what they are, so they have to create a message and a discourse around those products, so they have to communicate with consumers. And in many instances, they have to create a market. Now, remember that this is awarded to a group locally, and the idea is to have international reputation, right? Is to be able to defend your product claim internationally. And however, there's also another issue related to that, is you need to have a sufficient production pipeline. You need to be able to sell on the various markets, and you need to be able to build export capacity or capabilities, which is not necessarily the case the day that you receive the PGI. So the day you receive the PGI is really the beginning of the trip, like one of my colleagues would say, rather than the end of the process. This is day one when it starts. Now, aside from the PDO and PGIs and reserved designations, there are two cases that I would like to bring to your attention, because There are other types of producers doing innovative things, and that would like also to get value added and recognition for it. So I've had the chance to work with a group of craft micro distillers, and the idea was to use a participatory approach with the producer group. So we try, they oftentimes start the process. You have to know that craft distillery is very young. However, it is booming, right? There's a lot of interest in new products, new product types, mix of recipes, and so on. So this is quite an exciting time. However, what we try to do here is to understand with producers the set of actions that they need to do. Because I mentioned a few things. I mentioned communications. I mentioned creating a discourse, maybe creating a story behind the product, and also the big issue of governance amongst producers. Because if the success is linked, if the production is linked to their capability to conform to the terms of reference, the success, the economic success is also linked to their ability to govern that process collectively to the best possible way. Now, the group of craft producers, they want to understand the set of actions that they need to put together. Many of them are experienced with other alcoholic products, such as cider or wine, some of them in cheese, and so on. So they are craft producers. Problem number one is that there are 3 business models to start with in distillery. Every one of them call themselves distillers, micro distillers, and they are creating products in Quebec. So the first type is they buy or import a neutral alcohol base and they create mixes. And they claim that they are micro distillers. And on top of it, they claim this is also a local product, although the alcoholic base might be coming from another jurisdiction. Basically, they are mixing stuff and they sell it as a Quebec product. And they've had institutional support to some extent to the government-based liquor store, which is a state monopoly, to promote that as a local product. The second type is real distillers, just to provide a distinction, and they may buy inputs from other producers in Quebec. They may buy grapes and they may buy apples or whatever other input to make wine, cider, which they will later distill and create real alcohol from it and create their own recipes. And then the group that we were working with is a group that produces everything at the farm, and typically were apple growers or grape growers. They've been producing wine or they've been producing cider or whatever. They've done everything, so they're vertically integrated on their small business, and then one day they buy an alembic and they decide to experiment with it, and they make some product that is interesting, and they say, we are real craft, authentic, Quebec-based products. So you see right there, we're not going to try to go further into this, but just to be able to distinguish this, you have to get journalists, you have to get wine experts, you have to explain to them the distinctions between these products because, the average person doesn't know the difference. Now imagine if you produce these products and you're trying to sell that to a consumer. The consumer will go to the retail store run by the government, will see all selection of Quebec-based products, and essentially won't know the difference between this one versus the top one, right? Plus, those are a little bit older, so they've had time to establish, a reputation of sort. They have clientele, and the products are getting increasingly known, and some of them are even being exported to Europe in many places. So essentially, this is an interesting case because these guys are trying to figure out how we're going to be heard, right? So as part of the work and some of the questions that they've asked themselves was to say, okay, these are some of the actions that we need to take in order to be recognized, and what is the best path to obtain institutional support and even legal support. So some of the elements that they've thrown on the table during the group discussion was, for example, to regulate that craft spirits sold as Quebec products use raw material produced in Quebec and distilled at the property base in Quebec. So this is clear. However, this is not all of what's done. Ensure liquor store train employees on the differences between craft and non-craft or industrial spirits produced in Quebec. Because employees who sell the products may not know the difference, so you have to educate. To clarify spirit production methods from different distillery production permits between craft distillery versus industrial. Establish an independent accreditation body to determine the spirit status. Focus effort on local development of the industry. Master steps involved in production of raw material, if you want to be a real craft producer. And then put in place traceability systems at the distillery to track down the history. And make sure that you produce high-end, authentic craft spirits recognized by a reserved appellation, like a reserve designation, that can put them in world-class spirits. So these are ideas that craft producers have, essentially just trying to work, how are we going to do this? So I spare you the methods that we use to generate this. Any one of them who's trying to do this in his own distillery after spending time next to an alembic will not get to this. But if you get them in a room and talk, you can create something like this that is very consistent and statistically robust. So as you can see here, you have the communications and promotion and branding. So these are the elements that they will put forward. However, what that does is it helps create market. What we see here is quality development, for example, is very much linked to market development. So we have this reinforcing feedback loop. And all these institutional partnerships and collaboration that relate to the various ministries, whether that be agriculture, public safety, finance, as well as other institutions regulating the industry, that needs to work to support the development of the industry. Here are some of the barriers to entry, and all that reinforce here the collective visions and values. Because when you talk with craft producers, they say, let's not waste time to discuss who we are. Let's take the time to discuss how good our products are. And this is what we need to define, and this is what we need to communicate. But the next sentence goes, yes, but defining our products is also defining who we are. So there's a real identity element related to the collective vision and values that the group develops as part of the process. Now, before getting into this case, I mentioned that when the day you get the certification or the day that you get reserved designation, it's only the beginning of the story. Well, these guys have been working sort of in parallel. And as good economists, they know which part relates to demand, which part relates to supply, and some of the resources that they need to mobilize, and some of the value that's going to be created as a result of quality development. So these are the long-term feedback loops, but in the meantime, they need to work on developing the collective vision and values. That means the governance of their group, as well as the communications, and also to ensure that they develop the terms of reference and that the product quality is good. Now, this is just to show that when you do this kind of work, you can also ask them to, see what's important and also see what's feasible. And what's interesting here, they're very strong, obviously, on communications, promotion, and branding, because every day they open the newspaper and they find some article that talks about products that are local products but are made with inputs from other places versus the local-based produced alcohols. Now here you also have very important collective vision and value, relatively feasible, but you see they are still struggling, even though it's important, about quality development, which is considered less feasible, obviously market development, and institution and partnership development also. So it's interesting because you can go back to that set of feedback loops, understand which ones are reinforcing, and which ones are also balancing, which ones are limited. You can communicate and you can promote and brand your product as much as you want, but if the quality isn't there eventually, that won't work on its own. You need to have the development quality to develop your market. Seems like a basic thing to say, but it's also a very important element. Another one, which is also very different, uses another approach. It's called the acerum. No, acer in Latin is for maple. So this is alcohol based on maple. And distilled fermented maple sap concentrate or maple syrup. And depending upon the distiller type of permit you have, you may either grow the maple tree and the maple syrup, or you may purchase it from a third party. And there's a term of reference that is determined by the Union des distillateurs de spiritueux d'érable. And this one is a certification registered with the Office of Intellectual Property of Canada, and it is owned by the union. So this is taking a different route altogether. And its mission, very similar, but it's a different tool. Here is to hold a certification brand in Canada and internationally, establish a terms of reference with a serum certification criteria, issue licenses, audit every year, and reissue licenses and permit that allows you to put that stamp on the bottle. And of course, to promote. So some summary thoughts, because this is just to expose you to something that you may not have known about, and that you may find intriguing given your understanding of what's happening here. This is a slide I'm taking from a colleague who works in this area, who has arrived from his experience. He's actually helped develop many terms of reference for producers. The reserve designation potential, we're talking about potential, obviously, maintains tradition, know-how, and knowledge, maintains immaterial heritage, supports the commercial development. So it protects a name, for example, as an IP function. It guarantees product characteristics, like control function, and promotes local and international marketing function. So which one is best? Is it best to have a trademark? Is it best to have certification marks? Is it best to have the reserve designation? As lawyers would say, the jury's still out. Okay. So economic value does not materialize on its own. You may have a great legal framework. You may put everything into place. You may do everything according to the books. But what we've learned from our experiment, which is parallel to what some other colleagues have learned doing their own work, is at the center of this, if you want to make sure that your PDO or your reserved designation succeeds for the group, communication, the strategy at the heart of it, and the collective governance, the vision and value that is developed as a result of that. Now, is this the path from local to global? Because the consumers locally, they may know that perhaps there are no differences in quality between a product that has the PGI and another one that doesn't. For example, the wine growers in Quebec, they've imposed that in order to be able to grow ice wine, you needed to have the PGI. The cider folks decided not to do that. They left it free for the producer to decide whether they wanted to put the PGI stamp on it or not. And you may guess what happened. Very few of them felt the need, to go through the process, given the costs, and given the fact that perhaps they only sell locally, and therefore this may not be all worth the trouble. So agri-food producers are innovating in various ways and use a portfolio of IP management tools at their disposal to get some traction for their innovation, recognition, promotion, protection, and market development. And the road from local actions to protect IP to global institutions and market for these products is also unclear, because you may have heard about the comprehensive economic and trade agreement between the European Union and Canada. Canada has recognized all the PDOs and PGIs European based, but there's not been reciprocity in terms of the agreement to recognize the Canadian framework or even the Quebec framework, because that's a provincial jurisdiction. Now, given this, international trade negotiation is a federal jurisdiction, and as I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, Quebec is the only place in North America that this type of framework, so it doesn't hold a lot of weight in the balance. However, that being said, producers who hold PGIs, they do make representations to various groups abroad. So, but this remains unclear and, of course, subject to debate. So, thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Martin, for your a really interesting presentation. And we just said with your speech another significant example of legal transplants, because PDO and PGI have been originated originally in France, and then from France transplanted in the European legal system, because in Italy, as you know, we didn't have a general law regarding PDO and PGIs. And nowadays it's coming there in Quebec, not through international agreements. It was very interesting, your last consideration, but on the basis of a local, own, regional découvert of this new tool which has been elaborated in Europe. And you know, this sort of legal transplants of this system of PDO and PGI is not the only example, that one of Quebec. We had the example of the Turkish legislation that adopted rules very similar to that. We have example of Thailandia, for example, that the basmati rice has been admitted in Europe, and then they adopted national legislation on the same basis, not through an international treaty, but just getting that model and utilizing that model. And then we arrive again to our friends in China. Even in China, they introduce some system of protection of PDO and PGIs. And I just want to spend really 1 minute on the last question. What happens when you get the registration? It is not the end of the road, it's just the start of the road. We have experience in Italy. As everybody knows in this room, Italy is the European country with the highest number of PDO and PGIs. I think it is something like 300 regarding other food and 400 regarding wine, more than France. But the first 10 PDO and PGIs have for the 92%, and the first 6 take for the 80% of the value every year. So the question is just the same that you used. Makes sense to afford the cost, the burden, the difficulties to get this, or may we use other tools like, for example, trademark or registration mark? This is not a matter that we are going to discuss today, but it's interesting, even always in this comparative looking, that the new European regulation on European trademark and directive on national trademark introduced in the legal tools in Europe the tool of the certification mark, which is a typical tool of the northern part of America and United States and Canada. Nowadays we have even by us, and so we will see what we will go to do with this tool. And again, it is a matter of competition and market. We always arrive there. So the last speech is our good friend and colleague, Professor Martin Holle of the Hamburg University, and it just has the last word because he's just speaking on the central topic, globalization of innovation, or globalization versus innovation and localization. We will listen with pleasure to you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and it's my pleasure to be here at Trento, so thank you for the invitation. I'm at risk now being branded as a heretic after my talk. This is for 2 reasons, potentially. One is that I partially at least, ignored a strong recommendation of our chair not to produce any slides. But as a citizen of the free Hanseatic city of Hamburg, a city that never bowed to anybody, I think that was a natural reaction. The second reason, or the second risk I'm running, is that in my talk I'm going to put up an analysis basically saying in the end that we are at a crossroads with food law now, whether it goes more into continue the harmonization road or whether we go into a localization road back to where we have been 40 years ago. And also there our chair is a bit more optimistic than I am, probably because he's Italian and not German, so maybe that's in the national character. Let's see. I would like to start with first with some words on global food innovation. What is food innovation and how does it relate to the law, or what does the law do about food innovation? Then show some indicators of a renationalization trend in the European Union, which we have in some areas, not everywhere, but certainly in some areas. Some examples of distortion of EU food law on national level, because we see that as well, which is, of course, there always have been different interpretations, but I think it's going beyond that today than what we had in the past. We have also examples of national challenges of risk assessments that have been performed by EFSA, where just some member states say, well, we disagree. What does that do to the credibility of EFSA? What does it do to the consumers' attitude towards food? Is it contributing to food safety or rather not? And the consequences then for the regulatory framework, or potential consequences, let's say, and some conclusions. So let me start with innovation. So innovation in foods is very much driven by multinational companies and by consumer trends. Consumer trends are determining the agenda, the innovation agenda mainly. That's true for the whole FMCG sector, so whether you're in cosmetics or foods, it's not so much a difference. And it's very different from technology. If you're Apple, you can just sell the consumer something he doesn't really need. Yeah, it's not a problem. You just innovate and then you sell it. Foods, it's a bit different. You have to watch the trends, and if it's not accepted by consumers, so it's very difficult to launch a product, say, believe us, this is a great thing, and if it's not resonating with the trend, it's quite difficult. And what you see is that some of these trends become increasingly global consumer trends. So apparently consumers around the world have similar issues, similar interests that they expect food industry to address, or food producers to address. I've brought some examples here. One is this health trend. Everybody knows, everybody wants to be healthy for longer. People are getting older, so they want to stay active for longer. And you have so typical claims on added benefits of the food. But it's not so much the problem solver anymore, like in the 80s or 90s, where you had something like the cholesterol-lowering products, and they're still there, but they're not that relevant anymore. It's more this holistic view of health. It's something that's good for me, giving me a good feeling about it, and that's what I want. And this is also the trend with the clean labeling to some degree, and no bad ingredients in there, organic trend and local trend, reduced whatever ingredient which is bad, reduced sugar, reduced salt, and so on. Also clean ingredients in general, or plant power, less meat consumption, vegan trend, that all fits into this idea of health. Also more natural sweeteners like stevia, even though it's steviol glycosides, which is not really a very natural ingredient, but it's perceived as natural because it comes from a plant. It's plant-based, so it's different from aspartame or whatever, which is a very perceived as more chemical. But this is one of the trends. Another trend is mindfulness, as the researchers call it. It's about what's in the food. Consumers want to know what's in there. Tell me. Yeah, I don't want just to believe you. Where does it come from? How do you make it? What values do you have as a company? Are you a good company? Are you a bad company? So people are interested in that. And the manufacturer's values as well. Very nice. So the transparency is a very important and honest statement. So consumers very soon get to know if you cheat them on your statements and you don't live up to your promises. And then there are some sub-trends connected with that, which is this ethic food and sustainable, fair trade, animal welfare, and the like, and what the marketeers called simple, honest ingredients. Yeah, whatever that is, it's a very nice statement. Doesn't mean very much, of course, legally, but also this spiritual food, very nice quote I found. In my food world, there's no fear or guilt, only joy and balance. Yeah, that describes basically this attitude very nicely, what it is about, this mindfulness thing. Yeah. And another one, convenience. On the other hand, yeah, so people want very healthy, but very honest food, very natural food, but it should be easy to prepare. You don't want to waste much time in the morning when you prepare your breakfast, or something you can consume on the road, or home delivery of ingredients. So this cooking packaging, where you get all the ingredients and the recipe, and then you can cook it at home. These type of things, yeah. So avoid the burden of having to do the shopping in the evening or whatever. This is another interesting trend. And yeah, food manufacturers are of course reacting to these trends, and they give new offerings to consumers, and this is also part of the innovation funnel of a company, of course. They work on solutions for these points. And this is just to show some global brands where you see this is really global. Good example, Pringles, which is basically some dried potato pressed into shape and used with different seasonings. So very easily replicable. You can replicate that very easily, that concept. Heinz tomato ketchup, everybody knows. You have a stevia version as well. You have an organic version now. So Pret-a-Manger is a very interesting concept, brings this naturalness into something that is, of course, a redefinition of fast food in a way. So it's not something which is really that natural or organic, but it's very successful with that story. And then you have something spotted also in Germany, some others, Aula skyr, which is a Icelandic type of fresh cheese or quark, and which is now rolled out all over the world because high in protein, low in fat, and that very nicely fits with what consumers want: more protein, less fat, less sugar. So also something that is scaled up from a very local to a quite at least regional or more global world. Or these dishes, the Knorr concept, which is also these products, these are more like a seasoning bag of seasoning with a recipe on the back of pack, but they create all kinds of dishes which are inspired by regional ethnic cuisines, and they are sold all over the globe eventually. So you have these global innovations on a large scale, and this is mainly also the driver of innovation in foods. So breakthrough innovation is very much big company innovation. Small companies may also innovate, may come with a new idea, but they will remain very local in their local market, very small. But this is, if you talk about innovation in food, that's mainly those scenarios. And the big companies are riding consumer trends, of course, and taste and lifestyle of many consumers are also influenced the other way around. So people buy these products and they have a certain expectation that comes with it. And you can do that in a short period of time across multiple regions. So innovation cycles get also faster. Innovations very often also fail, so you need the next one to come. So innovation is very, very crucial. And consumers get increasingly also exposed to internationalized campaigns. Advertising is produced for the whole world, more or less, and you see these commercials and advertisements on a daily basis. And at the same time, also these global food companies basically take a responsibility for food safety, because it's their brand that it's at stake, so reputational issues. So food companies make sure via their specifications, for example, via their controls, that the food is safe, because otherwise they may have a problem and there's severe damage to their brand equity, which will cause more damage than the recall itself. It's the damage in trust. And so they make sure they're setting their own standards. Yeah, what about food law in this context? Food law has always struggled to keep up with these developments, because by nature is national. So it's something that's maybe European at best, but it's far from global. So it's probably not a surprise that it struggled, and we have, of course, the Codex, we have ISO, which made a contribution, we have the Global Gap, for example, but otherwise it's mainly private standards today that basically have outpaced the law in regulating this area, because if you're a multinational company or a retailer operating in many countries, you make a contractual arrangement based on Global Gap, based on IFS, on BRC, not based on any legislation around the world, basically. In that sense, I mean, this establishment of the harmonized EU framework for food law and for quite a big market of probably 500 million consumers was a big achievement, of course. And with 28 countries, from next year on 27, unfortunately, but still a major part of Europe, this has been a catalyst also for European integration for a long time. So food law played an important role also in the further integration and establishment of the single market, because it was one of the most important categories of goods. Also, the Cassis de Dijon case of the European Court, of course, has brought a general acknowledgement of this principle of mutual recognition, which also was a big driver. And then we had the General Food Law in 2002, which introduced safety standards. Many countries in the world are still aspiring to today, so it's certainly a big achievement. And all this happened, and this is important, on a common set of values and shared goals that the member states had. There was always some quarreling, but by and large you had some shared values and common goals. However, today you see that a trend towards renationalization is emerging, and we see complementary national legislation that is added on top of the harmonized EU legislation. There are more of these escape clauses as well in the European legislation, where you are allowing member states to regulate, which was not so much the case in the past. And national interpretations of EU legislation are getting more and more inconsistent with the common EU law principles, and there's not this general acknowledgement of common principles that much anymore. And this also undermines to some degree, of course, the general validity of EU law across all member states. Also the public disagreement with scientific findings, as I already said, is another problem, because if you don't like what EFSA says for political reasons, you have your own risk assessment authority asking them for opinion that disagrees with EFSA. So, and eventually the question is, to what extent is also the European Commission still in the driving seat of EU law? Is it not much more the member states? So I think the Commission has taken back the level of responsibility for the development of a joint and harmonized food law. And so my question eventually is, have we reached this turning point in EU food law now? And also the harmonization, will that come to a standstill or at least to a reduced pace? If we look at the renationalization trend, the first indicator was also already the strengthening of the principle of subsidiarity in the Lisbon Treaty, because that was spelled out very much in detail and was very much stressed in those negotiations also by the member states. So there was a clear desire of the member states not having a further integration at the pace that was happening at that point in time. So there was a clear, already at that point, there was a clear signal that there's some break built in now, that it will go slower than before. So member states were not so happy with the ever-deepening integration, and they defended space for national regulation. And this was mainly basically the exposure to a globalized world, I think, and the neoliberal world order we were facing. So the member states or governments and also parliaments, national parliaments, noticed that they were losing control over some things, because you have multinational companies operating all over the world, and your influence on their their actions is very limited as a regulator. And this sentiment of a loss of sovereignty, that was recurred basically also in the Brexit, because it was exactly the same thing. The reason why people voted for the Brexit was because they wanted control back. They wanted back control, whether it's immigration or some other aspects. It was about control, regaining control. And that's, again, showing this general development that some people feel it was a bit too much integration. And Jean-Claude Juncker, as the President of the European Commission, after the Brexit vote, declared in his State of the Union address that it was not the Commission's intention to seek ever-growing competences, and that the EU would give back competences to member states where it makes sense. Yeah, so it's a clear signal as well. Yeah, we are handing back things. Of course, Mr. Juncker will only be there for a few more months, so it's probably not for him to decide anymore, but it's a signal. Yeah, and then we saw also some other signals in the secondary legislation, thinking about the Directive 2015-412 on the cultivation of GMO plants. That's where specifically the Commission handed back the competency to the member states. So there is a EU decision, but eventually every member state can opt out of that and can decide that whether they want cultivation, under which conditions, and so forth. And that was, of course, the result of this long standstill which we had in deadlock in the discussion between member states and Commission with every single GMO application. There was never a vote of the member states, and so always the Commission had to decide, and they always got the political blame. And now, of course, this was a way of handing this responsibility back and the blame back to the member states. Was also a very elegant way of doing that. So I think that was the first one. And another one is in food information, where you see it in two areas, which is food information. If we talk about nutrition labeling, there's an escape clause or a specific clause for national provisions, which was, and the other one is, in Article 35, 38, 39, and 43, they allow specific national provisions on nutrition labeling. And also origin labeling is another point in food information. Also there, under specific conditions, in Article 39, you can have national provisions on origin labeling. And you can also have additional mandatory requirements on pre-packed foods. So this is quite an interesting development, because before we had directives, which were more comprehensive. Now we get a regulation which is binding but less comprehensive. So it's also quite an unusual thing. And then we didn't have to wait for long for the opening moves, which was the UK with the traffic light system, which interestingly enough was not notified because it's they said it was not part of it was not a nutrition labeling scheme, not a mandatory one, and that's why it's not in scope, which is quite questionable. There are also quite a number of conditions that need to be met, which are mentioned in Article 35, which first is that they're based on sound and scientific valid consumer research. It should not mislead the consumer. Okay, that's not a surprise. The development is the result of consultation with a wide range of stakeholder groups, so you have to consult. All this was done by the UK, by the way, so it's not that they didn't meet that. They should aim to facilitate consumer understanding of the contribution and the importance of food to the energy and nutrient content of the diet. And they must be supported by scientifically valid evidence, and that it's well understood by the consumer. So if I think about some of the systems, like, for example, the Nutri-Score system in France, I'm not so sure all this has very strictly been verified. So also there you see that the Commission lets member states get away with things, and these obstacles to free movement of goods that are created that are not really taken into consideration in the overall equation. One should also bear in mind that the UK always said the system was voluntary they're introducing, but in fact it wasn't really. I found some interesting remarks by members of the UK government saying, we should make everybody join this scheme. If you're not joining, then we will shame you on a website somewhere. And also the retailers all said you will not be listed if you are not having a traffic light system on there. So you are excluded from UK retail in facto. In fact, if you would not, de facto, if you wouldn't use the scheme. So in theory it was voluntary, in practice it wasn't really. So there was no real opt-out. The Dutch had also their own interpretative nutrition labeling system, this TIC, which they use, and that was duly notified to the European Commission, but as a nutrition under the Nutrition and Health Claims Regulation, not under the nutrition labeling regulation, and it received a positive opinion, so that was okay. France introduced the Nutri-Score system after notification as well. That was indeed under Article 35 of the food labeling regulation, and that was also accepted basically by the Commission and the Member States. Can of course say, okay, this might be doubtful whether all these different national schemes are efficient from an internal market point of view, but at least you can say it was somehow EU-friendly, because the member states played by the rules, they notified, and there was an evaluation, and so that was exactly what the law basically requires, so not so much of a concern. However, in the area of origin labeling, and I know that will be now a bit of an upsetting subject also here in Italy, there's also a rule for the justification of national measures, which is Article 39. And according to that article, you need a specific ground for justification, as the usual ones: public health, protection of consumer, prevention of fraud, prevention of unfair competition, and the like. So far, so good. In addition to that, you need, however, a proven link between certain qualities of the food and its origin. That must be shown, and the member state must provide evidence that the majority of consumers regard the origin information as of significant value. National initiative started as soon as the Commission had said we are not intending to do any further origin labeling rules on EU level. There were these reports on milk, on meat as an ingredient and the like that were presented by the Commission, and where the Commission refused to take further action based on the insight that consumers like this origin labeling, but they don't want to pay for it. And it has an impact on consumer prices, of course. Yeah, the national, interesting is the timing of when all these initiatives started, which coincided with the end of the milk quotas and the guarantee prices for milk, and quite some problems for, in particular, smaller producers with regard to that situation. And that's why it's not really surprising that many of these origin labeling rules on milk are in those countries where you have a lot of small dairy farms, like France, like Italy, like Poland. So it's, let's say, slightly suspicious that this thought of origin labeling evolves just at a time where this special competitive situation arises. Yeah, and in the meantime, 8 member states have introduced, or at least considering such national mandatory origin labeling, mainly for milk, dairy products, and meat. And to make this compatible with EU law, most of them only apply trial periods, 2 to 3 years. So that was one of the conditions, apparently, of the Commission to allow this to go through. The Romanian one was stopped because of that, because it didn't contain any provision on a time limitation. Yeah, if you look a bit closer at the legal requirements in Article 39, you can question to some degree why all milk in a country should have a specific link to the origin and a specific quality that is also relevant to the consumer. Yeah, I mean, if you produce milk in different parts of a country, there will be differences, and different methods of production will make a difference. But the fact that it originates in a specific country per se can never be a real difference and make the real difference in quality. And there's also some, it's very easy to test that. If you ask which meat is the best, if you ask in France, French meat is the best. If you ask in Italy, Italian meat is the best, and so on and so on. So the truth is probably that in most countries you can buy good meat and bad meat. So it's not something that has to do with the origin of the meat per se. And so I think it's a bit questionable whether these links of all the milk or all the meat produced in a country is really proven. In addition, the Court of Justice, of course, has already 30 years ago, in some rulings, has already spelled out the requirements for the compatibility of national quality schemes with EU law, and in particular with the Article 34 of the treaty. Of course, as long as your secondary legislation allows for it, you're in principle fine. However, you must justify your limitation, your restrictions based on Article 36. Yeah, also in the partially harmonized area for that part that is not fully harmonized, that is not harmonized. And for this reason, arbitrary discrimination or disguised restrictions on trade are not permitted, even if all the conditions for national provisions are met. How such discrimination through national quality schemes could look like has been spelled out by the court already at that time. We had this by Irish, we had the German Markenqualität aus Deutschen Landen, so it was a very similar. So we had all these promotions, and the court held basically that it would be contrary to Article 34 to engage in publicity intended to discourage the purchase of products from other member states, or to disparage those products in the eyes of consumers, or to advise consumers to purchase domestic products solely by reason of their national origin. So it's quite clear words on this. And if you look at the execution, you see very different forms of execution of the origin labeling. Yeah, you have this Polish product, Czech product, one thing. We have this Italian one where you have it somewhere in the overall labeling. Yeah. But this one, is, I would say, slightly bit more of advertising for a certain origin, and probably also putting products from other countries at a disadvantage, because and all these campaigns enhancing purchasing of national products and saying this buy them because they are better. This has all been discarded by the European Court at that time, and so. You cannot promote national origin as such as an indicator of superior quality. There must be something more to it. And otherwise it's an unjustified discrimination of foreign products. Of course, these court rulings are from a different time, and it's a different legal context, because at that time we didn't have at least not a partial harmonization in that area, so it was the full Article 30, 34 at that time, now 34, 36. It would be interesting to see how this would be handled today by the court. The question is, will anybody go to the court today? Yeah, so that's the first condition, and so far, I mean, with the Commission agreeing or okaying these initiatives, it's a bit of a question mark whether the Commission would take any member state to the European Court. Other countries seem not to be too keen to challenge that as well. So remains to be seen. But it clearly is a trend to relocalization of food law. It's not only Europe where this happens, this is Australia, so you have this nice kangaroo showing how much of the ingredients come from Australia. So it's not originally a European idea. Distortion of of EU food law on national level. That's a second phenomenon. There has always been some inconsistency in the interpretation of EU food law between the member states. That's a matter of fact, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what happens now is that this agreement goes beyond these minor deviations that you have all the time, but it goes to the fundamentals and to the common understanding of key principles of EU law. And one example I would like to pick is this one from the Netherlands. Bicel, it's a margarine, and excuse me, there's something on omega-3 and on heart health, and there were also some statements made on a website where it's about the heart health benefits. And then, of course, you talk about, you're not allowed to talk about diseases because that's in the prohibition. But of course, you make some statements about blood pressure, maybe, and whatever, and depending in which country you are, this may be regarded as a disease statement on a disease. Because problem with health claims is health is always the flip side of disease. So it's the matter how you express it and how something is perceived by a certain regulator that is not always clear in advance. So the Dutch authorities basically fined the company, but not based on the food law, which is the Article 7, paragraph 3 of the Food Information Regulation, which prohibits medical claims for foods. But the Dutch authorities basically classified the product as a medicinal product based on Directive 2001/83 by presentation, because this product would make claims on disease, and that's why it's considered a drug by presentation. And they continued that stance, which is quite remarkable, because if you apply the usual methods of legal interpretation, there's no way that you come to the conclusion that this product could ever be regarded by the well-informed average consumer as a medicinal product. I've never seen anybody who expected a margarine in a supermarket shelf to be regarded or classified as a drug. Yeah? Nobody in their right mind. You can have doubts about the claims, and you can say, okay, this might have been prohibited claims for a food. Yeah, but and if you look at a systematic interpretation, you would not need Article 7, paragraph 3 if every medicinal claims made a medicinal product by presentation. So it would be completely meaningless, that provision. So there's a clear distinction between a food making a prohibited medicinal claim and a medicinal product by presentation. If you use whatever dextrose tablet that doesn't do anything, sell it as prevents cancer, yeah, that's a drug by presentation. That's clear. But this was not the case. So why did the Dutch authorities took this approach? The reason is one that is in the national law of the Netherlands, and it was a very interesting one, because the Dutch law on consumer goods had a maximum fine for such a claim, prohibited medicinal claim, of 4,500 euros at the time, which the Dutch authorities found was not really quite deterring for a multinational company, which is of course right and absolutely correct. And but rather to resolve the whole issue by saying, okay, this time we may not be able to fine more, the legislator must take action on this, they basically pushed and dragged the law on medicinal products in that direction, because there the maximum fine was, I think, 450,000 euros, and they issued a fine of 150,000 euros based on the medicinal law on medicinal products. Went to court, which doesn't happen very often in the Netherlands, and even the Rotterdam District Court upheld this decision of the authorities, and didn't even touch on this point whether margarine could be regarded as a medicinal product. There's a problem we all know. If courts have to deal with food law, sometimes it's not very easy to explain, and particularly if it's court that usually deal with more general matters. And so that's how these things sometimes happen. Yeah, this might look as a pragmatic solution from a perspective of the authorities, but it has a very negative effect on the EU law, because one of the fundamentals, this distinction, is torn into pieces. And they even tried to manage support in Commission working groups for this interpretation. And I think that's a very short-sighted approach, but it happens. And the ironic thing is that since July 2016, there was a change on the consumer goods law. Now you can fine up to 820,000 euros, which is more than you would get for the medicinal product. So now it would be just the other way around, which is a bit ironic. So you see, it can be solved on a national level, but it's very dangerous to pursue these things. But we have also a similar development in Germany, which is on unfair commercial practices. There we have a ruling by our Federal Court of Justice, Bundesgerichtshof, on health claim, and it was about a product. I think I've got it here. This one, it says good for learning or strong learning, and also something about concentration. And there's this girl on the picture, and the company argued. This is our trademark, this girl, and has been around for 40, 50 years. So know that, yeah, drink that one, yeah, I hope so they should perform really well. Yeah, yeah, excellent. So they should be exceeding, of course, all the expectations now. Yeah, this is a juice basically, and added some B vitamins and iron for concentration. There's an authorized health claim for that. There's also a claim on children and cognitive function for one of the ingredients, but in the EU. But there is, the problem is now that in the EU we have a guidance on health claims from 2007 on the interpretation what is regarded a children's claim according to Article 14. And the children's claim is according to that definition, which was agreed with the member states in the working group, that a children's claim is a claim that is specifically valid only for children and is based only on science for children. And this is what basically was also mentioned here. And the court said, no, it's enough that it's also consumed by children, making it a children's claim. That means any product that has some cartoon characters or whatever on it and makes a claim on calcium, a yogurt that makes a claim on calcium, that is good for the bones, would require a children's claim according to Article 14, which requires a special authorization. And the problem is you can never get that authorization because EFSA would refuse to assess that because they say it's Article 13 and we have already done that, we are not going to do it again. Which means that by this ruling of the court, there's a de facto prohibition of these type of claims because it's considered a children's claim that doesn't have an authorization, but you will never be able to get an authorization because in Europe you handle a different definition of what is a children's claim. So this is again something which is, I know where it comes from because it's a court on unfair commercial practices, on competition matters, so that they look at what is the average consumer takes out of it, but they take not into account the further consequences of what's happening afterwards. For the company it was not a big deal because they have one Article 14 claim they could use and the rest was upheld by the court that it's okay. So it was not a major problem for them, but for the rest, for all the other claims, it will be a big problem. So it's at least worrying to see that the highest court in a member state is not taking notice or just discarding a guidance that has been agreed between all the parties and is taking their own view, which they are entitled to do by the law, of course, but it's not really helpful and it's leading to fragmentation. One more point, the national challenges of EU risk assessments. You know this one, BPA, bisphenol A, which was a case where France has issued unilateral measures, a blanket ban basically of all foods and food contact materials containing bisphenol A, despite the fact that EFSA had regarded the substance as safe, and there were 3 EFSA opinions in the meantime. And there was something about drinking bottles for children. There is a prohibition, but otherwise the levels were not high enough. But the French authorities also considered, for example, the intake of bisphenol A that you could have from handling receipts that you receive at the cashier of a supermarket. And the concern was not so much with the clients, but with the people at the cashier handling those receipts. And this was all built on into the risk modeling, so there was a different approach. And there's a long history, 2006, 2008. There were the EFSA assessments in 2012. ANSES in France, the National Risk Assessment Authority, gave a different view, and France adopted the ban, invoking the safeguard clause in the... Sorry? Bisphenol. In the regulation on food contact materials, 1935-2004. There was this safeguard clause. And EFSA conducted then another safety assessment of bisphenol A, completed in 2015, and confirmed its earlier opinion. Still, as an olive branch, the Commission offered to change the value for bisphenol A from the migration level, maximum migration level from 0.06 to 0.05, just to make a point and to reduce it. But still, France did not change their view on this, and they even managed in another group, in another committee, Member States Committee of the European Chemicals Agency, to classify bisphenol A as a substance of very high concern. Yeah, which is trying to undermine basically what EFSA has assessed before. As a result, EFSA will look into it again, and the opinion is due for 2020, so we will see. But it feels a bit like if we don't like the result, we go to another assessment until we have the result we want. And I think it's assessment shopping. Yeah, it's a good, probably a good one. So the question really is, I mean, you can disagree to some degree, but this is really a very planned and very strongly orchestrated lobbying activity. It's not just a disagreement. It's aimed at bringing EFSA into disrespect. It's aimed at achieving their own national goal at the cost of European institutions. That's a bit different from what we had before, where we had disagreements and scientific disputes and all that. And it's also not in the spirit of the safeguard clauses, because they were made to allow member states to act swiftly in case of emergencies and not to basically use them as a weapon in the battle on scientific beliefs. Yeah? But this is used as an instrument for something it was not designed for, really. And consumers watch this at the sidelines in a complete amazement and don't know who to trust anymore. And this doesn't help to maintain a high standard of food safety. Because food safety is not about the fact only, it's also about consumer perception of food safety. And this is not contributing to food safety. So at best, consumers don't believe anymore that foods are safe, and even worse, they go to other sources than authorities if they seek for scientific advice on what is safe and what's not. Yeah, to conclude, the consequences for future EU regulatory framework. Yeah, what is the underlying pattern and how will it impact the EU framework? At least some member states seem to feel increasingly constrained by an EU legislation that apparently does not address their needs adequately anymore. So why would there be activity if there wouldn't be a need? So there's a need, and EU food law seems not to address that. Initially, the reason might have been the substantial and very rapid enlargement we have seen with the enlargement in Eastern Europe, which brought in a lot of different cultures and a lot of new opinions, of course. And it made it also more difficult to agree on things because there were more views around the table. Yeah. But the other thing is, as I mentioned, the lack of control in a globalized world that is felt very strongly by the countries. And also consumers share this view. So there's a feeling one is exposed to these big global companies and global trade, and it's not much we can do about it. So it's probably a bit try to get back control. Whether this is always backed up by reality doesn't matter for the political process, because it's there, it must be dealt with. And the question is how the EU legislator will basically react to that. So far, things have run in a quite disorderly fashion, and very much on the on a single case basis. And member states pretended to stay in the EU legal framework, but at the same time were working on undermining this framework, and by silently rejecting some principles that were agreed before. So it's not always an open revolt, it's sometimes also quite hidden. So what we need basically is an open discussion on the desirable level of harmonization in food law, and particularly in fields where it seems difficult to reach agreement in detail, you might have more an agreement on general principles and more opening clauses than we had before. And it's really time to think about structural reforms of the current system. One of the crucial questions there will be how to preserve what has been acknowledged as the shared dimension of food law. So coming back to our subject here as well. Because the renationalization will, of course, almost inevitably lead to diversification of provisions. And there could potentially be 27 different national rules eventually on certain subjects. This is not desirable from a European single market perspective and also not from a competitiveness perspective, because Europe will lose competitiveness if it breaks up or fragments into 27 local jurisdictions, again, in some areas at least. So how can you accommodate this tension that you want to adjust to local specific circumstances on one hand, and on the other hand, you want to support also international companies and research and innovation? Yeah, one solution could be a more extensive use of the mutual recognition principle, which the Court of Justice had developed in the Cassis de Dijon case, which has been neglected for quite a long time because it was not so easy to enforce. There's a new proposal of the Commission now on the strengthening of the mutual recognition principles. And yeah, if you say that all products enjoy this right of free movement in principle, then and you require a justification for any restrictions based on the grounds in Article 36 of the treaty, then those restrictions must further be necessary and proportionate, then I think that would be quite a good tool to ensure an effectiveness of the single market, even if you can't agree on harmonization anymore. But there must be at least a common denominator. It's also not something, mutual recognition is also not something that is specifically to the EU. We also have this in trade agreements. If you talk about organic products, US and EU, there's a mutual recognition on the organic labeling, for example. So there's something you can also use in international trade, this principle. There's a big however, which is if you want mutual recognition, you need mutual trust. And I think what we are lacking at the moment is this mutual trust, that all countries in the system pursue the same objective, and that every country is concerned about their citizens, and it doesn't really matter whether the regulation is phrased in this way or in that way, as long as the standard is maintained and there's a high standard of safety and consumer protection maintained. But I think this trust seems to be in short supply, where we have these conversations very much around us versus them, and me first, and that makes it quite difficult to enter into this debate. But if this confrontation cannot be overcome, then the development of food law, joint food law principles will be very difficult. And eventually what's going to happen is probably that the control will shift from the public sector to the private sector, and more of these standards will be used, and they will regulate even more things than they do already now. So to conclude, innovation is increasingly global, regulation is lagging behind, that's not a surprise. EU harmonization is slowly but steadily getting undermined at the moment, at least in some fields. National interests often prevail over the common good, and regulators need to re-identify joint values and objectives. If they fail, the private sector will take control. So that's my talk. Thank you much for your attention. What a pleasure.
Thank you very much, Martin. In fact, you put on the table a lot of topics and objects, and so we could discuss longer, but we do not have too much time. I don't want to take time to anybody who wants to intervene. I just wanted to have only a short underline, because you asked, would anybody go to the court? And I will ask, yes, I will do with pleasure against the Commission, because you are saying that we are today looking to a discussion of EU food law at national level. We are seeing a discussion of EU food law at Commission level. I just want only to stress to the participant a very small, easy point. European Parliament is doing an exceptional work for unification, non-harmonization. of EU law, as you well know. And in the General Regulation on Information by Consumer, there is a specific detailed rules that says, by 13 December 2014, the Commission shall submit reports to the European Parliament and the Council regarding mandatory indication of country origin or place of provenance for the following goods. Types of meat other than beef. 2. Milk. 3. Milk used as an ingredient in dairy products. 4. Unprocessed food. 5. Single ingredients products. 6. Ingredients that represent more than 50 of the food. Did the Commission respect this deadline? No. What has done the Commission? Has done a regulation, an execution regulation, on the origin of meat different from beef, which did not respect the instruction of Parliament. The Parliament told to the Commission, your proposal, your draft of execution regulation is not respecting my regulation of the Parliament. We were speaking this morning about the legitimacy, accountability. The Commission answered, I have no interest to your objection because 23 of 28 member states in the group working with me were in favor, and in any case, it will be too expensive for the big food producers to respect the duties that your Parliament has for. I wrote to the Commission asking to know the name of the member states. Nobody answered never to me about the transparency. But the Parliament did not go in court against the Commission, even after the Parliament said clearly this is a violation. A second very small example, and I will close. What about ingredients? There is a rule that you know that says where the country of origin or the place of provenance of food is given and where it is not the same as that of its primary ingredient, the country of origin or place of provenance of the primary ingredient in question shall be given. It is very clear. For a legal scholar, it is clear. It must be given the country origin or place of provenance. And, you know, going back to what happens at European level, for the first time, the new regulation of 2011 established a formal definition of country of origin or place of provenance. So we had something much more than harmonization. We had unification of rules, because until that time we did not have any specific definition of a country of origin and place of provenance with reference to labeling. What has done the Commission? The Commission said the country of origin or place of provenance to be declared is one of the following geographical areas. And so they introduced another category and another paradigm. And the Parliament didn't go against the Commission. So the question is, and I close because you know, we could spend days and weeks discussing this. When in the legal system and legal institution there is a hole, someone is filling the hole. The Commission did not respect specific rules and deadlines, for example, regarding declaration of origin of milk. There has been a political and legal evaluation of the European Parliament of a general rule. It is important to declare the origin of milk. This may be good or bad, maybe a mistake, but the European Parliament adopted a regulation on this basis. The EU Commission doesn't want to respect the decision of Parliament. Nowadays, national member states are filling the gap. So the problem is that we do not have enough unification. On the other side, just to give a small part of hope regarding this desperate, divided Europe, regarding renationalization, on the other side, on the side of food safety control, we are looking to an extraordinary effort to unify the system of control, to unify the network of the authorities within Europe and outside Europe, as I told a few minutes ago, regarding even the writing. So we have this sort of, how to say, schizophrenic, strange, Arlecchinos design in Europe, because we have some areas of EU food law which are going in a systemic way toward unification, and other areas where my impression is that national players find place because the EU player is not playing today. Okay, I don't imagine anybody agrees on this, but in any case, we have still 10 minutes. I'm sorry but I didn't want to interrupt this so interesting speech from our friend Martin. If anybody wants to intervene, we have 10 minutes for discussion on the topics, all the topics discussed. So.
Good evening. Good evening. I'm Fabrizio Paratore from Rome. I have a question for Professor Ruan. I would like to ask whether in China food manufacturers and consumers feel the need of being protected by geographical indications or denomination of origin. We know that in China there are many different foods and many different traditions. Do you feel there is, in view of a reform of legislation in China, the necessity to protect local ways of productions or foods? Thank you.
There is any other question? Otherwise, I will ask our colleague. There is a question for you.
This question is a good one. But for me to return your question, have some difficulty to language because the language. So I suggest that after we private talk about it. It's okay. Thank you. Yes.
It's a matter of international global relations, so it is a delicate bilateral. Se non ci sono altre domande, avremo comunque anche domani una mattinata molto intensa e speriamo di avere tempo per la discussione finale e così via. Volevo, a nome di tutti gli organizzatori e i colleghi, a nome dell'Università di Trento, di cui mi sento in qualche modo figlio adottivo, e dell'Associazione Italiana, ringraziarvi per l'attenzione di oggi. Ci diamo appuntamento domani mattina con la sessione che è presieduta dal collega Umberto Izzo e che ha per tema quello del diritto agroalimentare e tecnologia, Agri-Food Law and Technology, e adesso prego gli iscritti all'Associazione Italiana di Diritto Alimentare di restare perché abbiamo un'assemblea.